Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam from Historic Travels and welcome to another video. And as always, before we get started today, I'd just like to take a quick moment to welcome all my new subs and to thank everybody who's been leaving me comments and messages down below. Thank you all so much, I really appreciate it. And if any of you out there would like to take a couple of extra steps to help support the channel a little bit more, there's a merch store and a Patreon for this channel in the links below. Thank you all so much for all your support. Alright guys, so before we begin today's video, I do have a quick announcement to make. This video is part 2 in my Heroes of the Titanic series. Now, in part 1 of this series, if you didn't watch it, I'll include a link to it in the description below. I did say that this was going to be the last and final episode of the Heroes of the Titanic series, and I was going to tell the story of 2 more heroes who contributed greatly to saving lives on board the Titanic. Although, once I started filming this video, I realized I basically need an entire video to tell the story of one person who was a hero on board the Titanic that night. So what I'm going to do is, I'm still going to tell the story of 3 heroes on board the Titanic, although I'm going to tell the story of the 3rd person in a separate video. So in this video, I'm going to tell the story of one person, and then in another video, I'm going to tell the story of the last and final person of this Heroes of the Titanic series. Alright guys, well hey, with that out of the way, let's now begin part 2 of the Heroes of the Titanic series. I hope you all enjoy, and let's get into it. Now, of course, if we're going to be telling stories of heroes from the Titanic disaster, we have to tell the story of one man in particular. This man is someone who, I would argue, probably played the most vital role in saving people on the night that the Titanic went down. The man that I am referring to is none other than Thomas Andrews. Thomas Andrews was one of the main designers of the RMS Titanic. He knew the ship better than anyone on board, which means that on the night that the Titanic struck the iceberg, there was no better person on board the Titanic who could quickly assess the damage Titanic received by the iceberg, and he was also the perfect man to determine if the Titanic was going to sink or if she could remain afloat. Now, in case you're wondering why Thomas Andrews was on board the Titanic during its maiden voyage, well, the answer is because it was the maiden voyage. On the ship's first time out, the Holland and Wolff shipyard liked to send a team of people with the ship in order to help troubleshoot the ship and make sure that there were no problems with the vessel on its first time out. This team is known as the Guarantee Group, and all of the members of this team helped build the Titanic, and Thomas Andrews was the one in charge of this team. So, honestly, if you think about it like this, it was kind of a blessing that all of these men who helped build the Titanic were on board the ship when it hit the iceberg. Because with all of these people on board, they would be the best ones who could quickly determine how much damage the Titanic received by the iceberg and if or if not the Titanic could remain afloat. Alright, so now that all of you know who Thomas Andrews was and how he was connected to the Titanic, let's now jump ahead to the night of April the 14th, 1912, just after the Titanic struck the iceberg. That way I can share with you guys some of the things that Thomas Andrews did on that horrible night. I honestly believe that once you know a little bit more about Thomas Andrews' actions on the night that the Titanic sank, you will begin to understand why I consider him to be the greatest hero of the Titanic disaster. Now, the RMS Titanic struck the iceberg on the starboard side below the waterline at 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912. At this time, Thomas Andrews had already retired to his cabin for the night, although he wasn't yet asleep in his cabin. He was just relaxing in his cabin before he went to bed. Now, it didn't take him very long to notice that something had happened to the Titanic at the time that it hit the iceberg. And what I mean by that is, he didn't have to wait for a member of the Titanic's crew to come and get him. He noticed right at the moment that the Titanic struck the iceberg that something had happened to the ship. Now, it's not known if it was the impact with the iceberg that Andrews noticed, or if it was the fact that the Titanic's engine stopped. But one of these 2 things got Andrews' attention, and he immediately went out on deck to try to figure out what had just happened to the brand new RMS Titanic. Now, based on surviving testimony, it's stated that Andrews emerged onto the Titanic's boat deck so quickly that he may have had time to see the iceberg that the Titanic struck floating off into the distance. Once Thomas Andrews emerged from his cabin, the first thing he did was he headed forward, because at the forward part of the Titanic, more specifically on the forward well deck, a large chunk of the iceberg fell down onto the deck, and this was kind of the center of attention for everybody on board the Titanic during the beginning parts of the disaster. This was obviously noticed by Andrews, and then once he saw all of the ice on the forward well deck, he then began to head aft to perform his own inspection of the Titanic to see how serious the situation truly was. Once Thomas Andrews left the area of the forward well deck, it seems like Thomas Andrews then traveled aft down the A-deck promenade and eventually ended up in the forward grand staircase. Once there, Andrews ran into a couple of passengers who asked him if anything was wrong with the Titanic, at which point Andrews said that the ship was probably okay, but he was going to head down to below deck to inspect for damage. Now, once Andrews left these passengers, Andrews then headed to the Titanic's engine room to meet up with the Titanic's chief engineer, Joseph Bell. Now, after these two men met up, eventually Captain Smith joined them in the engine room. Once all three of these men were together, they then proceeded forward to the damaged sections of the Titanic to see for themselves if the Titanic was badly damaged by the iceberg impact. Once Smith, Andrews, and Bell left the Titanic's engine room and headed forward, the first areas that they wanted to check out were the Titanic's cargo holds as well as the post office. These areas were located in the bow of the Titanic in the first 4 watertight compartments. Now, in case you don't know this, these areas were badly damaged by the iceberg, so when these men arrived in these areas to begin inspecting them for damage, they would see the seawater rapidly flooding these compartments. Once the men saw that the cargo hold areas were basically lost, they headed to the post office, only to find that the ocean was also flooding the postal office as well. When they entered the post office, they saw the Titanic's postal workers frantically trying to rescue the mail that was stored on the Titanic before the seawater destroyed them. Once Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews saw that the Titanic's postal area was flooding, they would know that this situation was a lot more serious than what they may have initially thought during the beginning parts of the sinking. You see, where the post office was located in the Titanic's 4th watertight compartment, this area flooding was basically the maximum amount of seawater that the Titanic could take in and remain afloat. So, once they saw the post office flooding, Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews parted ways. Captain Smith wanted to head up to the boat deck to begin prepping for an evacuation if it was needed. At this point, the Titanic had not yet been declared doomed. And then once Captain Smith left, Thomas Andrews continued his inspection to see if there was flooding in any more areas. Now, once Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews parted ways, we don't know for certain where Thomas Andrews went next because there is no surviving testimony to say where he went, although, logically speaking, he had to have gone to Boiler Room 6 and 5, which were the Titanic's 5th and 6th watertight compartments. And then, once he saw the flooding in those areas, he would have known that the Titanic is doomed. Upon seeing the flooding in Boiler Room 6 and 5, Thomas Andrews then headed back up to the boat deck to tell Captain Smith the terrible news, that the Titanic was going to sink. Thomas Andrews found Captain Smith on the Titanic's bridge at roughly 12:24 a.m. At this time, Thomas Andrews told Captain Smith that the Titanic was doomed, and that he gave the ship roughly an hour, maybe an hour and a half to live, but not much longer than that. Upon hearing this, Captain Smith gave the order to begin loading all of the Titanic's lifeboats. Once Thomas Andrews saw that Captain Smith had the evacuation under control on the Titanic's boat deck, Thomas Andrews then decided to head inside of the Titanic to begin alerting as many people as possible that they needed to get up to the Titanic's boat deck as quickly as possible. Andrews would spend the next 20 minutes or so on the Titanic's A-deck level, telling everyone he could find there that they needed to put on their life jacket and get up to the boat deck as quickly as possible. Once he was done there, Andrews then headed to the Titanic's starboard side boat deck and headed to lifeboat number 7, the first lifeboat to leave the Titanic. While at lifeboat number 7, Andrews was telling everyone he could that they needed to board this boat, and I believe he assisted the officers a little bit in the loading of the boat. Lifeboat number 7 left the Titanic at 12:40 a.m., and once this lifeboat was away, Andrews then headed to lifeboat number 5, the second lifeboat to leave the Titanic. He once again assisted the passengers with getting into the boat, and I believe he helped the officers lower the boat a little bit, I think. And then, after this was done, Andrews saw that the evacuation on the Titanic's deck was being handled as well as could be expected given the circumstances. So, upon seeing this, Andrews headed back inside of the Titanic to see if there was anybody else there who needed to be urged up onto the Titanic's boat deck. Over the course of the next 30 to 40 minutes, Andrews was reported to have been inside of the Titanic, urging as many people as he could find to put on their life belts and get up to the boat deck immediately. Then, after this happens, it seems like Andrews disappeared from the public eye for a little bit. Now, there isn't an official timestamp as to when exactly the next sighting of Andrews occurred. However, if you're familiar with Titanic mythology, and if you've seen the James Cameron film, the next official sighting of Andrews is one that you're probably familiar with. However, it happened earlier than what you might expect. You see, according to the mythology of the Titanic, once Thomas Andrews did everything he could to get as many people as he could up onto the Titanic's boat deck, Thomas Andrews then headed aft to the Titanic's first-class smoking room, which was located around the Titanic's fourth funnel on A deck. And then once there, Andrews was reported to have kind of went into a catatonic state. He just stared blankly at a painting on the wall, not really handling the situation very well, and basically in a state of shock. And then, according to the mythology of the Titanic, Andrews would remain there until the Titanic would eventually sink. However, we now know that that isn't true. You see, while it is true that Andrews was sighted in the first-class smoking room, it wasn't as late as what was originally portrayed in movies like the James Cameron film and what the mythology of the Titanic would lead you to believe. It's now believed that Andrews was there somewhere around 1:30 or 1:40 a.m., a little over a half hour or so before the Titanic sank. He was reported there by a man by the name of John Stewart, who left the Titanic in a lifeboat at 1:50 a.m. But after this sighting, Andrews was then reported to be out once again on the Titanic's boat deck, throwing deck chairs overboard and doing everything he could to continue to try to save lives. So, while this story of Andrews staying in the first-class smoking room until the end isn't true, it does seem like that Andrews was in that room for a bit. It just wasn't as late in the sinking as what was originally portrayed. After Andrews finished throwing deck chairs off of the Titanic's deck, he then walked down the boat deck and headed for the Titanic's bridge once again. You see, at roughly 1:50 a.m., there were still a good number of lifeboats around the Titanic's bridge in the process of being launched. Once Andrews got there, he ran into a group of women who were standing around the boat, debating if or if not they should get into the lifeboat. At which point, Andrews saw them and basically yelled at them. He said, "Ladies, what are you doing? There isn't a minute to lose. You cannot pick and choose your lifeboat. Get in the boat. Get in right now. There isn't a moment to lose." So, this story right here is further proof that Andrews didn't remain in the first-class smoking room until the end. This story shows that even at this late stage in the sinking, Andrews was still doing everything he could to see that as many people as possible got off of the Titanic before the ship would eventually founder. After this whole event happened, it seems like Andrews continued to walk forward and eventually made his way to the Titanic's bridge, where at some point he met up with Captain Smith. Now there's a little bit of a gap in the time frame here as to what exactly Andrews did next. Although, during the final stages of the sinking of the Titanic, we do have one more survivor testimony into what Andrews did next. It seems like that Captain Smith looked at Thomas Andrews as the Titanic's final plunge was beginning at roughly 2:10 a.m., and Captain Smith told Andrews, "We cannot stay any longer, she is going, we have to go." The last official sighting of Thomas Andrews was that he and Captain Smith jumped from the Titanic's portside bridge wing railing into the sea as this part of the ship was beginning to dip beneath the surface. And that was the last official sighting of Andrews. Now, what happened to him after that, we really don't know. Thomas Andrews' body was never recovered, and after that, it's mere speculation as to what happened to Andrews after that. But now that you know Thomas Andrews' story, I want to share with all of you why I feel like he was probably the biggest hero in the entire Titanic disaster. And I'm not taking anything away from all the other heroes who were on board the Titanic. There were a ton of people on board the Titanic who did incredible things that night to save lives. But the reason to me Thomas Andrews is the most important hero, or the biggest hero of the evening, is because it was him who ultimately told everyone, we've got to evacuate the Titanic. It's because of his inspections of the ship, and it's because of how well he knew Titanic that he was able to let Captain Smith know that, yeah, we need to evacuate as quickly as he did. Because a lot of people like to give the Titanic's officers a hard time because it took them an hour to launch the first lifeboat. But the thing is, you don't want to launch lifeboats on a ship unless it's absolutely necessary. Because, people can get killed just from launching a lifeboat. So they didn't want to do this unless they absolutely had to. So if Thomas Andrews hadn't been on board the Titanic, it may have taken the Titanic's crew a greater amount of time to figure out that, yes, the Titanic is sinking. it's because of Thomas Andrews that they were able to figure out how dire their situation was and how they needed to get these lifeboats away as soon as possible. And then even after Thomas Andrews did that, he still continued to try to help save as many lives as possible by telling them that, by telling the passengers they need to get up to the boat deck and, just doing everything he could to save as many lives as he could. So with that information, that's why, to me, Thomas Andrews is the biggest hero of the evening. Because if he wasn't on board the ship, I honestly feel like the loss of life would have been much greater. All right, everybody. Well, hey. With that, you now know the story of Thomas Andrews and everything he did to help save as many lives as possible on board the RMS Titanic on the night that she went down. Now, if you enjoyed this video and would like to learn more about Thomas Andrews, then I would encourage you to head over to Tom Linsky's Part-Time Explorer YouTube channel, because on there, Tom Linsky and his team made an incredible documentary showcasing everything that Thomas Andrews did during the Titanic's maiden voyage. Tom Linsky teamed up with the authors of the Titanic book On a Sea of Glass to create the most accurate retelling of Thomas Andrews' actions in that documentary. Seriously, guys, if you do not know about this book yet, On a Sea of Glass is literally the best Titanic book out there. I've often said that I consider this book to be the Bible on the Titanic. If you would like to check out this book, I'll include a link to it in the description below. But anyway, guys, so hey, be sure to stand by for part 3 in this Heroes of the Titanic series. If you enjoyed this video, please leave it a like. Be sure to subscribe. And if you're watching this video on the day it premiered, I do have it set to premiere on April 14th, 2022, the 110th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic. I will be going live tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, so I hope to see you all there. All right, everybody. Well, hey, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Have a good day, everybody. Special thanks to our Captain Level Patreon supporters, Jeremy Hack, Jeffrey Clayton, Dakota Charbonneau, Moosh, and Greg Gallick. Thank you all so much for all the support.